Hi everyone, welcome to our marketing and brand awareness webinar on our segmentation. We are just after 12, so I think what we will do is get started. So firstly, my name's Becca Rowe and I am the Consumer Insight and Marketing Executive at Fair4All Finance. And yeah, so today actually is our third webinar on our segmentation since we launched last month. And this one is focusing on marketing and brand awareness. So just to sort of give you a quick recap of who will be talking today. So first of all, it will be me, and I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of our segmentation. And then it will be Tom Johnson from Trajectory, who has done the research. And then we also have Michelle Lane from Fair4You, who is very kindly going to share some marketing case studies that they have been working on. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We are going to be recording the session. We'll also be sharing slides. And what we will do is use the Q&A function during the webinar, so you can ask questions in there during the webinar, and we've got some time at the end to go through them. We will note the questions down as we go through, so please do put them down when you think of something. Just to say that these are being shared, you can share them anonymously, but please don't put any confidential confidential information in there, because it will be published in the live chat. Anything that you want to say or ask us that does involve confidential information, please do contact us offline. So right, we will get started. So what is the purpose of today? We have put together this webinar to share with you findings specifically around marketing and brand awareness. These findings come from our segmentation, which, like I said, was presented a month ago. All the documents are available on our website to download, so the full information on the segmentation, this report, and also a credit usage report as well. So today we're focusing on understanding the data we have around awareness and usage, and how that can help organisations in the community finance sector shape their marketing strategy and delivery, with particular focus on the different segments. And if you've got particular segments you want to know more about, if you think they're a particular target for your organisation. So on the next slide, we're just sort of just drilling down those purposes a little bit more. So what we hope today will help is to build financial resilience by delivering targeted, well-designed products, help diversify portfolios to reduce risk, and to help develop differentiated marketing plans. So to give you the tools to communicate and connect with your existing and new customers as individuals or segment groups, or groups within a segment, rather than sort of almost a homogenous financially vulnerable group. So what I'm going to do now is give you a little bit of background into our segmentation and the segments. So firstly, I should just tell you that, and I think you may well be aware, that we have defined the target audience as those who are financially vulnerable. And we are saying that there is at least 17.5 million UK adults in financially vulnerable circumstances. So firstly, I should say this research was done across the UK. And we've used financially vulnerable. It's a much more, we're not just focusing on those who are financially excluded. We think there are around 6 million of those in the study who are financially excluded. But for those who are financially vulnerable, it's a really challenging time. It's worth saying that we did this research back in March, We know how much more challenging things have got with the cost of living. So unfortunately, it's possible that our number at 17.5 million may have grown because of these circumstances. So in terms of the segments, so what I've done on this chart, they're plotted by age and also by vulnerability. So actually what it's worth saying is that this segmentation was not done, it was not driven by demographic factors, but we've plotted them on here to show you where these segments sit. So on the right hand side, you've got credit crisis and families and forgotten families who are the most vulnerable. These groups were already struggling quite considerably before the cost of living crisis. They were really struggling already. So actually, I think it's probably quite difficult for us to maybe even grasp just how much they are struggling now. So as you can see, credit crisis families are on the slightly younger scale and forgotten families a little older. In the middle, we've got 3 different groups. So your unsteady starters are a younger demographic. These are generally renters. They have quite varied incomes, quite a lot of 0-hour contracts in this group, and they're sort of starting out, and they've also got quite a bit of debt as well. Squeezed and sliding is probably one of the most broad groups. You will have some people in here that who have quite relatively high incomes, but they also have quite a bit of debt. And what we've seen is that they have become increasingly squeezed and are becoming more squeezed. They are generally families, but there's a number of couples in there as well, and singles. We've also got a mix of homeowners and private renters as well. Your ungolden years, our older group, they have a sort of quite fixed income, often a pension, but they have a real struggle to get more income in, which is probably a real concern to them. And then further to the left is difficult debt, again in that middle age range, again quite high income compared to some, but much more debt in this group. So yeah, on the next slide, I just want to show you a table that summarizes the segments. Now, like I have said, all of this is available in a report, which I'd really encourage you to read. But what this just gives us is just a quick top line summary, some of which I've already said, but it shows you the different age, the different housing tenure we see across the segments, as well as income, and also the different products these groups use, because it does very much vary by use. And what I'm going to do now is hand over to Tom at Trajectory, who's going to start taking you through the findings, and we'll demonstrate how, as well as products being very different across the groups, we also see marketing and awareness and accessibility being quite different across the groups as well.
Thanks very much, Becky. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. So my job is to take you through some of the more detailed findings from this project, and dwelling chiefly on some of the findings that have come out of a major quantitative study, but also trying to weave in a few of the insights that we picked up through a program of face-to-face interviews up and down the country, and some depth interviews too. So moving on to the first slide, and looking initially at the amount of attention people told us that they paid to different types of information sources. So we're looking here on the charts for each of the segments at TV adverts, leaflets and flyers, adverts in other places online, and then finally social media posts by companies that they follow. And one of the things you notice immediately is that the attention paid to TV adverts is relatively high across the board, but actually it's only the highest for the oldest segment, the ungolden years. And even there, it comes with something of a caveat in that it's a sort of best of a bad bunch, really. This isn't a segment that say they pay very much attention to that kind of information really anywhere. TV advertising is a bit higher for other segments. For all of the other segments, from unsteady starters through to forgotten families, it's between about a fifth and about a quarter, saying that they pay a high level of attention to TV. But really, it's social media posts that dominate, particularly for those first 3 segments, which are all towards the younger age, of the age spectrums, the unsteady starters, squeezed and sliding, and credit crisis families. It's social media posts that really dominate there, and those are followed but then by other online ads and then print alternatives, the leaflets and flyers. I'm going to come on and talk a little bit more about social media in a second, but I just want to dwell on that TV point for a moment too. So if we move on to the next slide, you can see immediately just how much variation there is in terms of the type of channels that people watch. And also, not only are the younger segments, so again, thinking about unsteady starters, squeezed and sliding, credit crisis families, not only are they less likely to pay attention to the TV ads that they do see, actually, based on the channels that they watch, they're actually less likely to encounter TV ads in the first place. So you can see the top TV channels or providers that those segments watch are typically subscription-based channels, video on demand, Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon Prime, that don't typically carry very many adverts at all. Netflix have just launched an ad-based service, but generally you're not likely to encounter as many adverts on there as you are on traditional terrestrial or Freeview commercial channels. Really, only the sort of second, the older three batch of segments, so from difficult debts, forgotten families, and golden years, is where we start to see commercial TV channels play a bit more of a prominent role. You start to see ITV1, Channel 4, Channel 5 and Sky, particularly for the young golden years, be bigger in the mix there. But ultimately, I think what we're saying here is that TV channels is a bit of a tricky medium for these groups. It's a relatively high cost channel, and also not one that most of our segments are likely to be paying a huge amount of attention to. Social media, on the other hand, moving on to the next slide, is I think a bit more interesting, a much better source, particularly for those younger segments, unsteady starters, squeezed and sliding, and credit crisis families. Here, Facebook and Instagram really dominate, but also you can see TikTok and Snapchat are in the mix as well and being heavily used. The majority of people in these segments using those social networks at least weekly. As we move into the sort of slightly older segments, you still start to see from an online sample some social media presence, particularly Facebook, which becomes overwhelmingly dominant for those slightly older groups, but also a few other sites come into the mix, Twitter quite notably. But there's an important, I think, caveat with this one as well. Attention isn't paid to just anything online. As we'll come on to explore in a bit more detail, trust is quite low in general for financial services. And we heard an echo of that in some of the face-to-face interviews that we did throughout the course of this project. Even the younger segments who spend a lot of time online, avid users of social networks and confident users of social networks, told us that they wouldn't just trust anything that they saw online, particularly if it was from a company they didn't already recognize, or if they just sort of stumbled across something. That obviously presents a bit of a challenge. It makes it harder for organizations with low brand awareness to get cut through to any new customers in those channels. Brands and organizations that they already follow, or people that they already follow, good old word of mouth is more likely to be a trusted messenger in that context. Moving on to sources of help. So where do they get their information from? And this varies a lot, I think. It's a really interesting breakdown across the segments here. First of all, there's a divide between, I think, the first three segments and the second three segments. For the first three segments, you can see that family, and then after that, friends are really prominent, strong sources of information about finances and about money. For the second three segments, difficult debts, forgotten families, and golden years, actually online sources, particularly comparison sites and information websites, are really strong sources. For information websites, think Money Saving Expert. I can't remember if we did a single Hall test or a single depth interview where Martin Lewis's name wasn't mentioned. He's not got a reputation as the most trusted man in Britain for nothing. Financial services themselves are also quite important, particularly the bank they have a current account with. We heard that quite often in the face-to-face research, people who've are quite likely to turn to their bank account provider quite early on in the process if they're thinking about something new, if they want to get some advice quite high up the list. But it's also worth pointing out, I think, that a significant proportion as we move down the list slightly, particularly around 1 in 5 forgotten families and 1 in 5 of the young golden years, say none of these sources are people they would turn to for help or advice when it comes to money. For some people in those groups, that was a sort of source of pride in the kind of independence that they were able to make decisions for themselves. For other people, it was not really knowing where to turn or not really trusting where to turn. It's also worth highlighting, I think, here, and this is particularly looking down the bottom of this table with some of the less used services or sources. A lot of them are sort of typically face-to-face or local providers. The council, debt advisors, credit unions are in there, systems advice as well. Now, this data is from the online sample, so naturally a bit of a skew towards online services. In the face-to-face research, we heard a different side of the story, and actually, particularly amongst people who are more likely to be digitally excluded, those sort of face-to-face and local services can have a really strong role to play. I think ultimately here, there's just where there is an opportunity for credit unions, for community finance providers, it's in tapping into existing networks in local communities and building through sort of families and friends as well. They are quite perennially trusted sources of information. I think to sum up some of what we've been talking about, I'll hand back to Becca.
What does this mean? So, as we said at the beginning, messaging should reflect consumer needs and priorities, and the needs and priorities within these segments are really quite different. So, an example that we were talking about recently was thinking about the energy crisis and the segments, and what we were thinking is squeeze and sliding. We've seen many are switching the heating thermostats down or not being able to have it on as much. Credit crisis families, forgotten families. We've done some focus groups recently where someone didn't have a cooker, had no way of getting a cooker, of replacing their cooker, and had to go and cook elsewhere. So you've got, same situation, different need. And so we really need to make sure that messaging reflects that. So if you're thinking about a specific segment, it's really important that you really think about the needs and messaging relevant to that segment. The next part is thinking about a multi-channel approach. Now, luckily, Michelle later is going to give us some real life examples of how that has been used and how effective it's been. But as Tom said, social media gives us a huge amount of opportunity in terms of driving awareness, but not always trust, which is why when you can have marketing materials in other places as well, it really helps validate that. But awareness on social media is also really important. As Tom alluded to, TV is an option. It's just a very often expensive option, and again it goes back to thinking about, well, hold on, the segments are using and taking in media in quite different ways. Information and price comparison websites remain incredibly popular. Where it is possible to have a presence on these, there is no doubt across all segments this would be really beneficial. The other thing to consider is referral partnership, particularly for those who are more socially and digitally excluded. So credit crisis families, forgotten families, and golden years, where partnerships can be created, can be very impactful. We've actually written a report into this, looking at partnerships between housing associations and community finance, and we'll put a link into the chat for that. And as part of the rollout of our no interest loan schemes, we're also looking at referrals as part of that. So I'll hand back to Tom.
Thanks very much, Becca. And yeah, just to pick up on a couple of those points and to go a little bit further into perceptions of financial services and how messages can be balanced to build trust. Now, starting off, trust in financial services isn't high. The data on the left here isn't from our survey, but from the Edelman Trust Barometer. So 47% of people generally, and that's sort of a nationally representative sample, so they generally trust financial services. That's not an especially high number, and it places the UK pretty poorly in comparison to some of our neighbours. We were ranked 18th out of 27 there, so relatively low levels of trust in financial services. And in the qualitative research, both the depth interviews that we did and the Hall test that we did, trust, or rather the lack of it, was often mentioned and often brought up spontaneously by the people that we were speaking to. It can often be based on quite a narrow outlook, quite a narrow perspective, a sort of lack of trust in one small aspect of financial services, or one very visible aspect of financial services, can be applied to any provider at any point. And I think that just gives you a little bit of context as to the kind of the kind of context that a lot of people are approaching their interactions with financial services in. One of the things that we also really found, I think this is speaking to the quote on the top right here, is quite often there can be negative perceptions, not just of the organisations, but of certain key words or aspects of interactions with financial services. So the word loan, for example, can often sort of turn people off. Sometimes things that look too good to be true will be viewed suspiciously. People will think, well, what's the catch here? I think that really is the kind of sentiment behind that first quote, which came from somebody, a debt interviewee who had, by all accounts, a really good relationship with her bank. About a bank account there, a savings account and a mortgage, all with the same provider. But did she trust them? No, she didn't. She wouldn't see them as being on her side at the end of the day, and that was the kind of dividing line. The second quote, I think, reveals a bit more of the hostility that we sometimes heard. It also reveals the kind of other side of mistrust, which is frustration sometimes with the way it's perceived that organisations are run, the lack of personal or human touch, the sense that some organisations have lost connections with their communities, maybe as they might have had in the past. And finally, that last quote is, I think, a really interesting one, because it reveals how I think providers have often got to walk quite a narrow tightrope with their customers. Even genuine outreach could be seen as money grabbing, as this depth interviewee puts it. I think obviously with the cost of living crisis, more organisations, more lenders are considering what they can do to help and getting in touch with customers to reach out. But actually there is the danger that for some people there could be a negative perception attached to it. Now, we're talking generally here about sort of mainstream financial services providers, and it is worth pointing out that credit unions and community finance providers were often the exception to this lack of trust. We'll talk a bit more about this in a second, but where people had heard of them, perceptions were generally positive, even if knowledge was relatively shallow. So moving on to the next slide and looking just at brand awareness of a range of different financial services providers. Now, first of all, what you'll see at the top is that there are quite a few, relatively high brand awareness overall. PayPal, unsurprisingly, the vast majority of the sample had heard of PayPal before. But the rest of those with reasonable levels of brand awareness are either buy now, pay later providers, Klarna, ClearPay, or relatively well-established lenders like Provident, Amigo, 118, and actually generally community finance providers, which are shaded teal, are much lower down the list. Even those that are a bit higher, we have some caveats over. The Co-op Credit Union, 16% said they'd heard of that, but actually we think there might be some people mistaking that for the Co-op Bank or other Co-op brands. There are a couple of organisations called Moneyline, for example, which might be helping to boost that awareness there. So generally, only a handful of the financially vulnerable population in our survey had heard of most community finance providers that we asked about. And it was a similar story at a local level too. In the full report, we look at awareness of local or regional providers just in those local areas, and the highest cut through is about one in five, so clearly much less. And clearly, therefore, just raising awareness is a real priority for the sector. But if we move on to the next slide, I think there is some real positivity here, and awareness just doesn't tell the whole story. This chart, I think, showcases a different side of brand awareness, looking more at perception and favourability. Now, this is just looking at the people who had heard of each of those providers. And for those people, we asked them whether they had a broadly positive or a broadly negative view of those providers, and this chart is the net result. So we've subtracted those saying negative from those saying positive, and the results I think here are really clear. Where people have heard of a community finance provider, they generally have a really very good view of it. In contrast, if you look to the wrong end of the spectrum on the right hand side, you see some of the really well-known lenders. So the people at the top of the previous chart, Amigo, Provident, 118, for example, have all got quite strongly negative perceptions. Whereas those that were at the bottom of the previous chart are in absolutely the right place on this chart, which is towards the far left. So organisations like Fair4You, like Conduit, like Street, and My Community Bank are all really, really positively viewed. And with that, I'll hand back to Becca.
Thank you, Tom. So again, what does this mean? So as Tom said, the positive perception of users of community finance providers is incredibly positive. So conveying case studies, independent reviews to showcase these positive relationships is really important. In addition, talking around the non-for-profit status, the local, physical, within the community part of many of these providers is also a real area of opportunity. Partnerships with trusted brands is also a really key area to look at. We see that can really help with trust and awareness. And I think just to sort of talk a little bit more about awareness and trust, it's incredibly important that there is awareness. No awareness is far worse than some awareness. We saw this, for example, with 2 products we looked at with some of our segments earlier this month. One segment was from a high-cost loan. One product was from a high-cost loan provider, where there were some negative connotations with that, but awareness was relatively high. Another was with a credit union product where awareness was very low. And what we saw is actually the high-cost lender product was more positively reviewed because at least there was awareness, which actually wasn't necessarily what I would have expected, and did really demonstrate the importance of awareness. Again, focusing on specific segments is key. So as we've said, squeeze and sliding and difficult debts, these are customers, they wouldn't use the language to call themselves prime customers, but they very much feel that they are, and that mainstream banks are where a lot of their products are from. But with all the changes in how squeezed their finances are becoming, there's a real opportunity for community finance providers to connect with these groups and demonstrate the cost savings that you could offer them. Finally, online interactions need to be user-friendly and simple to use. This is very true for older groups, particularly so under golden years, but it is also really important to think about this for all groups, because actually simple, well-created online interfaces make a huge difference to trust. Gimmicks and too much information and sort of just doesn't help with that. So actually online interactions need to be incredibly user friendly to help build trust with all groups. And now I'll hand back to Tom.
Thanks very much, Becca. So yes, a final couple of charts from me, this time looking in a bit more detail, credit union awareness and perceptions. And we referenced this sort of earlier in the quant data. Most people told us that they had heard of a credit union. Most people in our financially vulnerable survey, but only a smaller proportion of that population say that they've ever used one. 72% say they've heard of one, at least 18% say that they had used one. But actually, we found that knowledge was pretty shallow in the qualitative research, and the face-to-face research in particular. This was really borne out. Most people who had heard of them had but not used one directly, had little knowledge about what they did, occasionally venturing a guess, occasionally venturing an incorrect guess. The quote on the bottom right of this slide is an example of somebody who said that they definitely heard the term credit union before, but wasn't quite sure what they were for, thinking that maybe they were sort of debt collection agency. For many people, it was exactly that. It was a term they'd heard but never really thought about too much or understood. For others, it might have been something they didn't really know about at all. And one of the things we found consistently, both in the qualitative research and in the quantitative research, is that the biggest barriers to not using credit unions are all to do with knowledge, either not knowing what they do or not seeing them as being able to meet their needs or solve their problems. Only a handful kind of had sort of outwardly kind of negative views of them, sort of viewing them as being old-fashioned or having been previously rejected for a product from them. It was really all to do about knowledge and not really knowing how these types of organisations could help solve problems. Moving on to the next slide. So starting from that point that credit unions are viewed relatively positively, but that positive view is often based on fairly shallow information and misconceptions. It's worth going into a bit more detail about that, because we heard partly misunderstandings of what they are, so people thinking they might be debt recovery services, credit reference agencies. We also heard a narrow understanding of what they offer. So some people who had a better idea of what credit unions are might associate them with only one type of product or service. They might see them as just for loans or just for savings, but not understanding that there might be more that could be offered there. And the third thing we heard was occasionally poor reactions to the word credit amongst those who hadn't heard of them. This is something that we heard throughout, something I referenced earlier. People can have a negative association with anything that connotes or signifies debt or borrowing or credit at all. And for some people who hadn't heard of credit unions, but had that negative perception of debt or credit, the word credit could lead them down the wrong path. It could start to ring alarm bells. And so we thought exploring names was quite an interesting thing to do. In recent years, we're aware that some credit unions have changed their brand name. I sort of wanted to see if this affected perception in any way. To be honest, in the quantitative survey, there's no really clear conclusion from this, to be honest. There's no clear leading name at all. For the majority of the segments, names like community finance, not-for-profit bank, there's no huge sort of groundswell of support behind either of those. But the remainder are pretty much evenly divided between quite liking credit union as a term or quite liking community bank as a term. But interesting, I think, to sort of triangulate some of this perception with what we've heard in terms of people's association with credit unions and other community finance providers. And with that, I'll hand back to Becca.
Thank you. So thinking about what this all means, I think what's clear is that not only do we need to raise awareness of the sector, but we really very much need to sort of do an education job as well. So firstly, thinking about awareness, it's really important to remember that brand activity is longer term, and it can be quite hard to measure the impact in a short term and in a snapshot. Actually, some examples Michelle's going to talk through in a moment demonstrate exactly that. Partnerships with other organisations can be incredibly impactful. Again, to use Michelle as an example, but we're not actually going to talk about this time, but the partnership with Iceland has been really positive for Fair4You in terms of awareness and trust. Thinking back to those slides, your current customers are almost your major asset. They have a really positive perception of you, and this is a really, really important to leverage. Case studies of these people would be really, really well received. Things like loyalty schemes, referring a friend, the fact that particularly credit unions are community based, it gives a real opportunity to tap into that community network. We could see earlier on in the presentation that friends and family remain incredibly important when people think about financial advice. So actually, if you can infiltrate into those networks as a trusted place to go, then this could be really impactful. In terms of education, Tom alluded to sort of some of the research we did around names, and obviously credit can have negative connotations, but ultimately I think there needs to be a very clearly explained marketing campaign to demonstrate what credit unions are. The membership, for example, is a positive positive benefit, but for those looking in not necessarily understanding it, it needs to be quite clearly explained. So I think education is a really important factor as well. I'm now going to hand it over to Michelle from Fair4You, who's going to talk through some of the marketing they've done and the impacts that they've seen.
Thanks, Becca. Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you all. A quick introduction to me and Fair4You. So I've been with Fair4You leading the marketing for the last 2.5 years, and we were set up back in 2015 to be a disruptor. We wanted to challenge high-cost lenders and provide an ethical and fair alternative to low-income households struggling to access affordable credit for their household essentials, whether that be a cooker or a new washing machine. We've evolved a lot over the last few years, but our mission really has remained the same. We're here to change lives through better lending, and we make changes and improvements across the organisation every day, and marketing is no different. So if I move on to the next slide. Some of the challenges we face, I understand from speaking to a few other responsible finance providers, are not unique to us. And I'm hoping that by sharing some insights from a few of the initiatives we've had recently, I can help you get to those solutions a little bit faster and without quite so much of the pain. So we'll move on to the next slide. Our response to some of those challenges has been to adopt a multi-channel marketing approach. So we are combining online and offline channels to meet our audience where they are. And if we move on to the next one, thank you. So starting with TikTok, we trialed this back in July until October. And if we move on to the next slide. The challenge we were trying to overcome here was reaching our audience through the right channel at the right time, and making sure we weren't dependent on one platform so that we didn't have all of our eggs in one basket. So we believed that by working and improving on our online media mix and making sure we weren't relying on just one, we weren't going to have that dependency, we weren't going to see those issues that we have when platforms have technical difficulties, when they can't access their own server rooms. And we would also be able to reach more people and reduce the cost of doing so. And we chose TikTok in particular because it's a relatively new ad platform. It offered far lower CPMs because it has lower bidding competition and also has a very comparable audience to that of Meta. Moving on to the next one. Our aims were quite simple. We wanted to reduce our dependency on one platform. We wanted to reach a comparable audience at a lower cost, and we wanted to increase our retargeting pool for other marketing like Google ad brand activity. Moving on to the next one. So we ran it for 16 weeks. We reused creative from our Meta ads, and we had a separate testing budget to make sure our current activity wasn't impacted by the trial. Next slide. Results really encouraging. We saw a 14% reduction in CPM compared to Meta. We saw a 46% reduction in CPC compared to Meta. And while we did see a slightly increased CPA through the trial compared to Meta, since we've come out of the trial and we've had consistent spend, we have seen that drop to be comparable to Meta. Next slide. So some key considerations: we did have to pause activity for an extended period of time, which impacted TikTok's ability to learn and make improvements. So something to bear in mind. We also see peaks and troughs throughout the year across our platforms, and TikTok was no different. So something to also bear in mind. And most importantly, it's that you need to allow time for budgeting, bidding and audience alterations throughout the trial. As you can see from the charts, I think it really illustrates the volatility of a platform while it's still in the learning phase. And if we'd based it just on week by week analysis, we would have probably turned off the trial at about week 3 or week 4 when we saw those really big spikes in CPA. So next slide. So some key takeaways. Most important thing is just give it time. Let the platform learn about you and your audience and find the best placements. A great thing is that you can reuse assets. If you've got video creatives from your Meta ads, you can reuse them. They worked really well for us, but please do put into consideration with your overall plan that you need to refresh them a bit more regularly than with Meta. So we were looking at about every 1.5 to 2 months to make sure we don't get ad fatigue. So moving on to our offline media campaign, which we're running in Blackpool at the moment, and we started back in October. The overall challenge we were trying to overcome here was that we see our applications affected by seasonality factors, and our CPA increases at certain points during the year. So we believed that by trying to introduce brand awareness campaigns in a lower period of time, when we see a dip, that we would be able to improve the cost and efficiency of our lower funnel marketing activities during those peak periods. And we believe that by targeting a specific geographic location with a high proportion of our customer segment, we would get the best trial budget efficiency. Our aims were really simple. We wanted to increase brand awareness and brand trust in the Blackpool area and develop a list of customers that we could then remarket to post-campaign. So we ran it for 5 weeks in Blackpool, targeting low-income households, and we used this as an opportunity to really tackle that perception of us being a buy now, pay later, of us being like Bright House, your pay weekly store. We wanted to show that we are on your side. We're here to help you, and we distributed it across multiple platforms, so on digital, out of home, static out of home, and also leaflet jumps. Early results really encouraging. We have seen scans of the QR code for both the out-of-home and the leaflet drops. We've seen more engaged traffic from the Blackpool area to our website and more likely to convert to application. As you can see from the chart there as well, we've seen an increase in the Google Trends data. So I included Iceland Food Club launch there for you as a comparison. So a peak at 100 with that. And with the out of home, we have achieved above average from what we'd normally expect in the high 60s. And we've also had engagement from the local press and local MPs, which is great. So some key considerations for this one is that we did run it slightly later than planned, so it wasn't quite in our low period like we wanted to. It will take, time will tell for a brand awareness campaign, so long term we'll have a better idea of how it's performed. But one of the great things about using the leaflets is that it does extend the lifespan of this campaign, because it's one of those things people tend to put in a drawer, put on the fridge for a rainy day, and with the QR code they can quickly scan it and come back to our website and we can keep tracking them post-campaign. So all I would say is the marketing landscape is constantly changing. No surprise to anyone on this call, I'm sure. What was in yesterday is back out tomorrow. So I think it's just a really exciting time with the cookie literally about to crumble in the online landscape to explore new channels and also revisit some old ones. Thank you very much. I'll pass you back to Becca.
Thanks, Michelle. So finally from me, just wanted to take you through something that a project that we're working on to raise awareness of community finance providers, which, as you've seen from the data we've shared today, is something that we think is incredibly important to the sector. So we have been working with the team at Think Communications to create a campaign to try and solve the issue of low awareness, but at the same time very high satisfaction. So really spreading stories of just how credit unions have helped people in financially vulnerable circumstances. So we've had a really positive response so far. So we've had coverage in the Express, in This Is Money, and last week we actually had coverage on ITV News, both lunchtime and the evening, which was brilliant. Locally, we've also had a number of stories in regional press. So to give some examples, we've had Worcester News talking about the number of adults in Worcester in financially vulnerable situations, and within the article showcasing the local community finance providers that could help with that. We've also got quite a bit of work. We've also been working with BBC Local Radio, and there are due to be some local radio stories coming out now. Very shortly. We are doing this campaign now. We are also looking at how effective it is being and the impact of it, and based on that, this will shape what we do in terms of raising awareness next year. So I think that, in summary, is all from us. So I think now it's time for a Q&A. So I think we have one so far that's been put in the chat. So talking around sources of help, colleagues receive quite a low score. Is there a separate category for employers? I did have a check on the questionnaire and we didn't have employers on there. So no, sorry, so we didn't have that as an option. Do we have any more questions?
Try to come in with a bit more on that employers, colleagues point. If I can, it's a really good question. I think colleagues were low. The kind of category of sort of person-to-person relationship that was pretty low. If you look at their score in comparison to sort of friends and family, other people that they know, which I think speaks to two things. One, not everyone in these segments will be in work, so that might be sort of depressing the figures slightly. I think the other thing is there are possibly like to be a few more barriers in discussing any kind of sensitive issues around debt, around borrowing, around money management with people that you work with. But I think it is a really interesting question. As Becca said, we didn't ask about employers specifically in the survey, although employer did come up a few times in conversations with people, sometimes as a source of positivity, sometimes as a source of negativity around sort of money and help there, but typically confined to working matters, so about getting more hours, about flexibility, rather than, I think, as a source of information, you know, where should I go, what might be the right source for me here. But yeah, one to bear in mind for the future. I think it's a really good question.
Okay, great. Just to check whether we have any more questions. Okay. So just to finish, firstly, I'd like to say a big thank you to Michelle from Fair4You for sharing those examples. I think, yeah, it's great to see how this multi-channel approach has been used and the positive results you're seeing already. Also really interesting to hear about your foray into TikTok. I think that's definitely going to be a growing channel that community finance providers could use. Thanks again to Tom for sharing in detail the learnings on the marketing aspect of our segmentation report. Just on that, the links to download the segmentation materials are in the chat. So as I said, there's a full segmentation report, a marketing report and a credit usage report. The previous two webinars are also on our website, and this webinar will also be uploaded on the website shortly too. So yeah, we hope this has been really useful for you in terms of how our segmentation can help shape your marketing strategy, how rather than thinking about the financially vulnerable as a homogenous group, it really allows you to think about their unique needs and circumstances, and also the very differing ways they find out about financial services, the different consumer journeys that they go on. So thank you very much for listening.